Right, hey guys, today I'm going to be covering the recap of my fourth game from the Japan Open, and at this point in the tournament, I was on 3 out of 3, I'd beaten 3 more rated players, so everything was kind of going to plan, I guess. And in this round, I was expecting to once again play someone a bit higher rated, but the exact opposite thing happened. I played the lowest rated player that I played so far in the tournament, who was rated 1300 on the national rating system, and he didn't have a FIDE rating. But then I looked at this guy's results, and so far in the tournament, he'd beaten like three 2000 FIDE rated players. So he was kind of on fire and just going like absolutely ballistic. But yeah, so I knew I couldn't take this guy too lightly, and that he'd probably, of course, not be a bad player, despite what his rating might say. And I mean, I couldn't really do much before the game in terms of preparation because there's literally like no games on the dude. Uh, and yeah, I just decided to head into the game, just play my normal stuff, the E4, C6, just Caracan, and played 9-3, and it just doesn't really give away too much yet because after D5, there's a bunch of stuff you could do. You could play Knight C3, you could take, you could even play like D3 and go into this ending, which is something that's kind of been trendy recently, but I didn't think he would really go into this, and he didn't. He played E takes D5 and he played D4. And we have this exchange variation, but usually it's more accurate in this position. Usually the occurs via d4 here, takes, and knight f3 would transpose to what we had in the game, but this is a bit inaccurate, honestly, and bishop d3 is kind of a more accurate move order. This just makes it more difficult for us to develop our dark squared bishop. Light squared bishop. As opposed to the game where after knight c6, white will usually play bishop d3 or put their pawn on c3, but these two will usually transpose, and then black can easily develop their bishop on g4. But if this knight was back here on g1 and this bishop was here on d3, black couldn't develop the bishop so easily because if this bishop comes to f5, it would be captured by white's bishop. If it came to g4, it would be captured by white's queen. So, yeah, something to keep in mind. But my opponent, surprisingly, he didn't even play bishop d3 or c3 here. He played knight d3. And if you know anything about like d4 type positions, you would know that you shouldn't really put your knight in front of the c pawn. Like this is usually a positional error. And this already kind of indicated to me that my opponent, maybe he wasn't as strong as sort of some of his results so far in this tournament indicate, because this is something which strong players just don't really play. But nevertheless, I played continued fairly logically. He played h3, trying to kick my bishop away, and here I could take on f3. This is honestly pretty reasonable here, but I decided to keep his bishop on, just keep as many pieces on as possible. And here he surprised me a bit with move 95. And this is very kind of, I don't know how to put it honestly, but it just doesn't really feel right because he's moving the knight twice, and although he is initiating some kind of simplifications here, and honestly, the reason this didn't feel so bad to me was the fact that you could play knight takes e2, and here, as opposed to like with the knight being on c3, the knight's position is actually improving a little bit because now he can play c3 and kind of consolidate his pawn on d4 actually. So it wasn't completely terrible, but there's also this thing which we have to take into consideration here, which is that we can simply take on e5 and then play bishop c5, knight e7, castles, and white's pawn e5. I kind of misevaluated this during the game. I thought that this pawn e5 was actually sort of strong, but in reality, I don't think it's that good. The pawn on h3 kind of just looks out of place, and this knight on e2 isn't so good. This bishop on c1 can't be so easily activated, so I think black's actually just kind of slightly better, or just quite a bit better here. But instead, during the game, since I wasn't so sure about that, honestly, I just decided to play bishop d6 and stick to a structure which I was more familiar with after knight takes c6, b takes c6, since I knew I'd probably be able to get in like c5 eventually here, and I'd have this nice pawn majority in the center, and I was like, yeah, I can probably play this position. So the game continued with castles, and here I play knight e7. I could also play knight f6, and I mean, it's completely fine, but I decided that my knight on e7 might have some potential later on after I play c5. Maybe you'd want to come to c6, also on f5, it can potentially target this pawn here. But again, it's not a big difference between the two moves, and here he played b3. And here I thought his idea was to simply play bishop b2, and of course c4 eventually, but I honestly wasn't expecting him to play c4 immediately here. And this is where I kind of had to think for the first time in the game. I was just kind of blitzing out my moves up until this point. And yeah, I have to be kind of a bit worried of what I'm doing, because like if bishop b2 here, I was considering c5, and this should be good, but with him breaking first in the center, it's a bit less clear now whether c5 is something I want to do, because it's going to result in a lot of trades in the center, which maybe might not be exactly to my liking. Like I was looking at something like this, and I mean, this I wasn't exactly opposed to. Like, sure, there are some trades in the center. Sure, you might argue things are a bit drawish, but I felt optimistic about such a position because my pieces are just more active. This knight's more active than this knight. This bishop's more active than this bishop. Maybe I can even bring my queen to b6 and then just bring the rook to the center. And when I bring my queen to b6, it's also worth noting this pawn's kind of just being hammered down on. It's very difficult to develop this rook, actually. So I was fine if we had such a position, but I should also note he doesn't have to like just trade off all these pawns and activate my pieces. So but instead though, what I decided on was actually to play takes on c4 first. He takes back and then play c5. And my idea was that by doing it this way, I'm not even allowing him to take my pawn on d5, which would remove this weakness of a pawn here. And now after bishop b2, I should also note that if he tries like, well, like if he takes here, I just take back, and this is kind of the position which, the structure which I'm aiming for. Like this pawn c4 is the long-term weakness, which I can pile up against, bring my rooks on the c-file, double up here eventually, and I'm not like winning or anything, but I definitely have a like clear advantage. But also another thing to take into consideration here, another main reason why I could get away with this d5 thing was because after d5, I can actually just take, and play knight takes d5, because here queen takes d5 and I have bishop h2 check, and I'm just winning the queen here. So you can't really do that, which is an important detail to see. But actually might not have been that important in the grand scheme of things, because after bishop b2, which you played, just developing a piece, and just protecting the center, I guess, a bit more. Here I kind of assumed that I would just play like c takes d4 here. And I couldn't really see what else to do exactly. But the engine was saying after the game that that kind of seemed to be allowing white to get a little bit too active. I wasn't worse after that position, but I kind of lost some of my advantage. What the engine was saying is just go queen c7, but the reason I didn't like this too much was because after d5 takes, I no longer have this knight takes d5 thing, because it's like if I just take here, white just takes back when bishop h2 check. I'm not winning the queen because my queen isn't on d8 anymore. So instead, though, I would probably have to play something like rook f8, and I didn't really correctly evaluate such a position, because what I didn't realize is the fact that it's very difficult for white to actually defend this pawn here. They can't really put the knight on the square like c3, because that's going to create some very awkward coordination with this bishop here. It's going to be blocked off here, and this pawn on d5, it's a lot more of a weakness than my pawn on c5. Actually, this pawn could actually serve some pretty dynamic purpose off like c4 maybe. So yeah, it's definitely something which kind of something that I need to work on a bit, maybe like trying to properly evaluate such positions where I take on things that might look like weaknesses, but in reality I have some like dynamic compensation, I guess. Because I have this tendency to like my pawn structure to be a little bit like too perfect, I guess you could say. But yeah, I mean, what I did in the game isn't necessarily terrible, but again, it wasn't the most ambitious thing I could have done. And once again, after this, I made another mistake here. In my position is pretty decent, actually. He might have let me get away with stuff that I shouldn't have. And essentially, in this position, we got, after rook f(c1), what I did was not so good. I played bishop e5, and the thing that I felt was also I should note that back here in this position, I had to play knight f5. My knight, I thought, was in a slightly awkward square, but I had to do it to prevent mate. Essentially, I wouldn't want to play a move like f6, because then this gets weak. So I played knight f5, and we got this position. and rook f c1 happened, and I was a little bit surprised because I felt that him allowing me to play bishop e5 was something that he shouldn't have done, because after this my bishop gets really active all of a sudden. Well, actually, it's the wrong way to put it, probably. It's more that I neutralized his bishop, which I felt was quite active, and kind of just eyeing down this g7 pawn. I felt that if I didn't trade this bishop off, then it would long-term allow my knight to potentially be destabilized, which would in turn kind of lead to me just getting checkmated. But this concern wasn't quite valid. What I should have been focusing on more was the fact that I should just focus on hunting down this pawn, blockading it, doing whatever I can to just kind of stop this pawn in its tracks. And what happened over the next few moves is after bishop e5, he protected the bishop. I think this was good as well, because if he releases the tension like this, what allows my queen to get back active, but when he plays rook ab1, now if I take, it allows his rook to kind of get activated a bit more, could potentially help along here. But anyways, after rook a8, he just activated the c pawn here. I tried bringing my rook in, plays queen e4, kind of forces me to do something about this tension here. And I tried keeping it after rook d5, saying, okay, if you take here, my rook's going to get really active. But then he played c6, and I kind of realized that I was being way too optimistic here, thinking that I could just kind of get away with whatever I wanted against this guy. He's like, what, 1300? And that if he just pushed his pawn like this, I'd surely just be able to like scoop it up and win it easily. But then when I got to this position, I realized that things are not that simple, and it's like, what the hell do I do here? Like, I can't easily take this pawn. There's this tension which I kind of have to deal with, so I decided that in some lines, like, I kind of want to try and take this pawn, but it's very difficult to do so with this like lingering kind of rook here with back rank threats working. So I decided that let's play either h6 or g6 first, and I was kind of trying to decide which one feels more accurate, and then I decided to play g6. Again, maybe h6 is okay, but I felt that in some endings, if say like I was given a check here, this is like getting a bit deep, but like imagine that those pieces on there, if my king had to go to say like g7, here it would be a bit better placed, I thought, because one, would be a bit closer to the center, and also it would be defending the f7 pawn as well, whereas from like say h7, pretend I play like h6, like here, if I went to h7, then I wouldn't be able to defend this pawn, which could potentially in some endings be a bit maybe problematic. But once again, this is getting a bit deep, and whether this stuff is actually true, I don't know. But my instinct was, okay, g6, and he just took, and once again, I kind of realized that I assumed I could just take back the rook, and maybe I can, but after like queen c2 or something, I realized that with my queen here on c7, rook b7 is actually a really annoying threat to deal with. And the thing is that you have to understand with kind of past pawns is that queens are very bad blockaders. You want your queen out there kind of doing the hunting and like attacking the enemy and stuff. But when your queen is used to blockade the pawn, it's like you'd rather a knight or something or a piece that's less valuable. When your queen is doing it, it's like, why are you delegating your most valuable piece to like trying to prevent like your pawn from advancing? It really just doesn't make sense. So instead I decided that, you know, I'll play queen takes. I think this will give me better chances. The other line, I couldn't really see clearly how I was going to deal with that rook b7 threat, so I was like, okay, I'll go into this. He exchanged, and he played a move which slightly surprised me, king f1, protecting this knight here. And I can't exactly remember what my time situation was. Early on I had a bit of a time advantage, but then kind of here I started really tanking. I think I might have spent like 20 minutes here, and I went down for like 40 to 20 minutes. My opponent was around 30 minutes, so he all of a sudden got a time advantage after my next move. But here I felt I really had to start like thinking, which I hadn't been doing so far in this game. And the thing is, it's like, how do I prevent him from coming down with his rook here? How do I prevent him from like pushing this pawn, maybe going rook b8? And I was thinking of a bunch of stuff. I was thinking maybe I bring my king in like this, but then I was like, rook b7 looks a little bit annoying. Kind of influence in this rank like this, and I just wasn't sure, and I wasn't sure because it's like, say after king f8, he not only has rook b7, but he can also play c7 and try to get in rook b8. But in general, I somehow wasn't too scared of this because I knew that, say like, let's go king e8, rook b8. Here I might even have this king d7, but there's also this move knight e7 that I always have, just bringing it back to defend the rook like this. But the thing to understand is that whenever my knight comes back to defend on the e7, his knight can always use the fact that now my knight isn't attacking this d4 square, so his knight can come into d4 and try to be active, like maybe we'll come into knight b5, attack this stuff, and it's kind of very scary, and I wasn't sure how to deal with all this stuff from afar. And so when in doubt, when you don't know what to do, try and set up cheapers. It's a great philosophy to live by. So I played rook d5, and you might be wondering how this is cheaper. And the idea here is that if he plays rook b7, I suggest you to try and find the move here which I was planning to play here if he played rook b7. And it's using the fact here that when this rook came to b7, it leaves this kind of back rank a little bit weaker. And I actually can play rook takes c6 here. And now if rook takes c6, I have rook d1 and this is mate. This kind of shows one potential reason why king f1 maybe wasn't such a great move here. And believe it or not, in this position my opponent actually played rook b7 pretty quickly, and I was like, I just wanted to like grab my rook and play rook takes c6 immediately just to show that I saw this, but I was like, okay, I'll think like for 30 seconds to see if there's anything I missed, but lo and behold, he just hung rook c6. Instead, what he probably should have done was push the pawn to c7, and yeah, here I wasn't entirely sure what to do again, because like if I play rook d7, he can always just play rook b7 to counter this, and this pawn I kind of have to protect, and it's not that easy to. I was thinking maybe knight d6, and I'm like, can do something like this, and maybe this is a draw. But I wasn't entirely sure. Like, I do have something like this, and he can take, and I don't know, maybe this is a draw. It probably is. He is this outside passer, but we can probably neutralize it somehow. So, yeah, I wasn't entirely sure what to do here. I was thinking that I can probably hold this though without too much trouble. I hope at least. But it was a huge relief that you play rook b7, because I'm like, okay, now I don't have to worry about even drawing this. I can just press easily, and should win without much effort. So in this position here, you play g4, and the idea is basically that now I can't move my knight like this, because then, well, I just hang my rook, because it's no longer mate. So instead in the game, I didn't hang my rook, quite fortunately, and I decided to exchange rooks like this. And here I had a small decision to make, and it was, I can actually still play rook d1 check here, and win this knight here. And here let me count the material. I think I'm 2 pawns up, but after this, it's now only 1 pawn. However, I think it was possible, like with rook h1, to more or less win this pawn, since he could defend it like this, but this would be a bit too passive, I think. So I was kind of thinking like something like here with a4, and this sort of position I wasn't so sure about. It was this past a pawn. I thought maybe this was dangerous, but the engine just completely dispels any misconceptions of that, and just says, no, mate, you're winning, you're fine. So I guess the engine's right here, and looking at it a bit closer, yeah, I can understand why, because let's say we do go into this sort of position, he just keeps pushing the pawn, like this. The problem in this sort of position is that your rook's kind of stuck here, and the pawn of course can't move without the rook kind of moving out of the way. And the king can't also easily come in here. It's going to take quite a while. It'd probably have to do this, and then kick my rook away, and then try to come all the way down here. By the time it does that, if it even achieves all that, my pawn's probably going to be so far advanced it's going to be able to promote. So something like this really is just not feasible. Thus, rook d1 was probably a much simpler win than what I did in the game, but you know, black's still up a pawn here, nothing too much to be afraid of. If he takes here, of course, this allows me to win a knight pretty cleanly. So instead he played rook b8 check and then activated his king like this, and I also activated my king. He played rook a8, But I think this was a bit inaccurate here. I think what he should have done was knight b3. Because the problem was after rook a8, I got rook a5 here, I protected my pawn, while also simultaneously attacking his pawn here. And I think maybe though I could have also gone rook c5 and after knight b3, rook c7. And I did something similar to this in a few moves actually, so this could have saved some time because I felt that my rook was actually in a pretty optimal position here, defending my pawn from here, where also it's defending some other pawns along this 7th rank. But I felt like rook a5 was quite good at the time because not only does it attack his pawn here, but it immobilizes his knight basically since it's stuck defending his pawn here. So he tried activating his king more, and I played rook d5 check. I just kind of changed my mind here. I was like, okay, I want to reposition my rook, and he tried bringing his knight in, but again, I thought like knight b3 was a bit more natural. But probably at this point it didn't matter too much since, like, if it goes here, I can probably just bring my king like this, and there's not much he can do. So he played knight d3, which kind of stops king e5, I guess. But I can bring my pawn to e5 actually instead. And now if my pawn coming to e4, that's going to create an entry skill for my king. And there wasn't really much he could do. He tried bringing his king in, which seemed a bit slow, but I mean, it's like, what else can he really do, right? So I just brought my king in. And then when I got to this position, actually, I realized after I played king e5 that he actually has rook takes a7, which I didn't notice. But I wasn't really cheating myself too much here, because I realized after this, like I can just go king f3, and his knight is so far away from all the action. This pawn is barely even advanced yet. Well, it's not advanced at all, to be more precise. And I'm going to take this pawn next and just advance my pawn, and there's not really much he can do. He might have to sacrifice the knight for my pawn in that pawn, if he can do that. And, well, even if that happens, I'm just going to take all his pawns and, I'll win. So I wasn't particularly scared of rook takes a7, even though I kind of missed it. So he played a4, I just pushed my f pawn. Again, I'd like to play king f4, but that would have my rook completely clean like that, so that wouldn't be good. And if I go king d4, I felt that now rook takes a7 might be a little bit more effective, because my king is to take a bit of a slow route to get to this pawn now, which, I don't know, like, maybe this is still winning, but it's probably just too lazy to calculate that, honestly. So instead I played f5, and my idea here is to push f4, and then go to e3, and I was like, yeah, this should be winning. I couldn't see any clear plan for him. He can't even go at rook e8 check, because my knight's covering the square, which is a nice point. So essentially it was just a matter of like him pushing his a pawn and contemplating when to take here and lose. So yeah, he played a5, I played f4. He now took here, but yeah, again, it's like too late. This doesn't really do anything. I play e3, breaking through, and here he took, but and maybe after takes this, he's holding this, but like, I wasn't gonna let him have that chance. I played f3, and now the king can't make it into the box here like this. So yeah, this was just pretty much losing for him. But he played one more move. I don't know what he was thinking really of this, but after knight takes c8, yeah, it's clear that this pawn isn't gonna make it. I should also note that his knight is completely boxed in here because it's covered by all these squares here, by all my pieces, and he can't also reach his pawn. So that was a nice kind of aesthetic thing, I guess you could say. Yeah, all in all, a weird game. It was like I got a nice position out of the opening, but then like around this position I started misplaying things. I don't think I exactly said what I should have done here, but essentially what I should have done is ignore this bishop and probably just blockade the pawn like this, something like bishop c5, and then bring my rooks to the center, maybe double up here, and I would have had a very nice position, but instead I kind of mucked around a little and let him get very active, but then I kind of got lucky here with setting up this cheapo with rook d5. Very sneaky move. Objectively it's not bad either, but yeah, it was very lucky for him to fall into this. Maybe you could say it's skill. That makes it sound better, I guess. And managed to bring the win home. But yeah, 4 out of 4 at this point in the tournament. I don't know if I'd say I was happy, because in 2 of my games so far against much more rated players, I'd basically almost lost. And yeah, but I managed to still bring the win home in those games, and perfect score at this point. Not too much to complain about, I guess, but yeah, I hope if you enjoyed this analysis though, I hope you like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and stick around for the next recap, which is going to be coming out pretty soon. And next round I was facing my first higher rated player from the tournament as well, so yeah, stay tuned for that. See you.